Welcome to the Hive. My name is Petit. I work for SideFX as a senior in-house technical director out of our tiny Wellington office. Today we'll be taking a walk through some of the new RBD tools in Houdini 18. Just before that, just a brief recap on some of the work done in that area with previous releases. So in 17, we started looking at high-level workflow tools to help with bread and butter destruction workflow. We introduced the RBD material fracture SOP and additional helper nodes to streamline the process of getting you guys up and running with RBDs. Taking care of managing the fracturing of the render geometry, constraints, and proxy geometry for different material types. Bullet also got some improvements. Glue constraints are a lot faster. A new Bullet soft constraint doc was introduced, which gives much better results than the dastardly spring constraints. 17.5, we really focused on an essential area with regards to RBDs, constraints, and in particular, creating the constraint geometry. We added constraint tools for interactive creation of the RBD constraint primitives, all the way to more procedural methods. The now established triple input output node framework, introduced with Vellum, got a look at also, benefiting all multi-output nodes. So including improvements for inspecting the various output geometry through the spreadsheet, node info, and output for view flags. So you no longer have to drop nulls to visualize the secondary outputs of nodes. Selections from secondary outputs now work without having to add intermediate nodes. If blasting from the second output of a split SOP, for example, if you try and select geometry interactively in the group palm, you'd know it was a pain. Bullet itself got a nice improvement in the way it handles instances for a slight performance boost and much better memory usage. Sorry. So for 18, the RBD material fracture SOP has seen a number of improvements. One of the welcome update is load time. And of course, as we stripped it down internally to make it load faster, we added a bunch more features to it. So it's a very large asset, so it still takes longer than we'd like to load, but it has improved. Edge detail fracturing is more reliable, and the cohesion between geometry and proxy is better preserved. In some cases, when pushing noise amplitude very high, the Boolean geometry is no longer correlates to its proxy, so they don't match in shape and size. So unfortunately, nothing on that front has changed, but in certain cases, you'd be generating more pieces or less pieces than in the proxy, and some of the proxy might disappear. So these orphan pieces are much better resolved now. We also preserve both the input geo and the proxy for recursive fracturing when daisy chaining fracture nodes. In 17.5, when plugging in geometry in a proxy to fracture, we discarded the proxy and generated new proxy geometry from the high res. So in 18, we preserve both if present. So say you fracture glass to get the typical concentric fracture patterns and then want to fracture it further for that safety glass look. Using simple Voronoi patterns from the concrete fracture, the original proxy will be preserved, avoiding introducing concavity in the sim geometry. So we've added lacunarity and level multiplier parameters. The concrete edge detail has now those two parameters for the noise on the recursive fractures for better control of the output shapes. So previously, you didn't have much control over the noise across the recursive fracture levels. So you'd have to daisy chain material fracture nodes to achieve better control. So the lacunarity controls the frequency at every level, and the level multiplier controls the noise amplitude. So it's not complete control, but it's certainly better than it was. So in this case, you can see I'm increasing lacunarity to get high frequency noise on the secondary fracture pieces, edges, and slowly increasing the level multiplier to make it obvious and show the difference in amplitude. Whilst on the first fracture iteration, the edge noise doesn't change. So chipping has seen a major overhaul. So previously it was another layer of Voronoi fracture with clustering. The Voronoi center cells being located on the corners of the pieces. They broke the pieces into bits, but not necessarily quite in the way you'd normally think of chips. So we wanted to break off sharp exposed corner pieces, the typical behavior you'd expect with prominent features in brittle materials. So the new chipping breaks off corner chunks, rounding off the edges of the input pieces for a more realistic look. We also output chips groups so that you can track these. So concrete chips, glass chips, etc. So those pieces can be manipulated later. So in case you get those long, thin shards, you might want to fracture them again. And if you do want to replicate the old chipping, you can replicate it by adding another recursion to the concrete fracturing and adding an RBD cluster SOP. So we got a lot of feedback about the lack of art directability for the fracturing, lack of control over the final shapes. So, but the constraint handling is pretty handy. So as we were looking into metal and finding a one-size-fits-all solution is still a little ways off, we added a custom material that allows you to input your own cutters to be used. So either as is or to be scattered around the geometry. So the aim is to allow you to work the way you normally do while retaining the constraint rewiring where necessary. So all the constraint management is handled for you. Additionally, an edge detail fracture option exists which allows you to input simple cutters for low density proxy representations, which then get remeshed and noised up to retain more detail in the render geometry. So using cutters to get the desired overall shape while trying to reduce the complexity of the proxy and hopefully avoid too many concave pieces which might need to go through a convex decomposition SOP to make them suitable for the sim. So as mentioned previously, when adding edge detail and pushing noise amplitude really high, things can get a little out of shape. Detecting those pieces that no longer coincide between the high-res and the proxy, we've added a RBD exploded view to help debug and validate the results. Makes identifying those mismatches a lot easier. So the geometry is shaded while the proxy is displayed as wireframe, and they move as one when exploded. So it helps you identify which ones need treating. So either replacing the initial Voronoi output with convex decompositions or packed spheres, either across the entire fracture, directly on the material fracture SOP, or manually afterwards for a more targeted approach. We've also added a bunch of various visualizers to help with that regard. So in blue and red there, we're using the geometry outside proxy visualization, which shades points on the high res which aren't contained within their proxy counterpart. The constraints can be shown as well, and they get exploded with both pieces. So that allows you to validate anchor position placement for at a glance. So talking of constraints, the default center of mass constraints from the RBD material fracture, while great for glue, aren't always really suited to other types of constraints. This SOP converts these constraints to different types by moving their anchor positions and creating more where necessary. They maintain all the attributes so you don't have to manage all that. So there's a few options. There's faces, which constrain the centers of opposite inside faces, while surface points you're probably familiar with from the connected adjacent pieces SOP. That connects points on the piece's surface within a given radius. So just a word though, it's probably best to convert constraints once you're done with all your fracturing, because at the moment all the rewiring can get tripped up when dealing with non-center of mass constraints. So with better constraint anchors and with the work with metal in mind, the bullet soft constraint now has built-in plasticity. This makes plastic deformations a lot simpler. Instead of having to jump through hoops, the usual rigmarole of jumping through constraints, glue and soft, and trying to achieve the deforming metal. So as with other dot constraints, these can be driven through attributes on the constraint prims, which can be set through the RBD constraint properties SOP. Linear plasticity can get pretty fiddly, so I normally just stick to angular plasticity, which just allows the bends to stick. And so now with plasticity, we wanted to be able to deform our RBDs rather than transform them. So the RBD deform pieces uses a couple of different methods to determine which clusters of proxy geometry pieces to use to deform the render geometry. So one being a cluster attribute shared between the render geo and the proxy. So for example, you can store the name of the initially fractured pieces before refracturing them to allow those pieces to bend and twist. And the other, for a more dynamic tearing effect, uses constraints to determine cluster boundaries. So the geometry will be deformed by all the pieces connected to and including the proxy piece with a matching name. You can also switch that attribute around. Specify your own. So that can give you some interesting dynamic fracturing-like results. The render geometry doesn't necessarily need to be fractured to the same degree as the proxy, so long as the prim's cluster attribute matches up with a cluster attribute on the proxy. You'll just want to make sure you have enough definition in the render geo though. That should help avoid generating unwanted internal faces for pieces that never break apart. So while that sim clearly needs a lot of work, the deforming metal is being shredded by using constraints to automatically determine deformation clusters. That allows pieces to appear to tear dynamically without having to worry about setting up attributes or complicated relationship between the render and the proxy geo. If you allow constraints to stretch too far before breaking, it can lead to some really interesting results where the pieces deform and they stretch before snapping back and opening up the cracks. So it ends up almost looking like gum. Sometimes you can't avoid having internal geometry, but you don't want it to appear until it's exposed. So talk to your lighters and compers about the joys of dealing with pre-shattered glass, and you'll know what I'm talking about. So we've added two new SOPs to help in those situations, the RBD connected faces SOP and its RBD disconnected faces counterpart. So the first one stores information about each fractured inside face's opposite prim at rest in order to then use that information by the second SOP. So after transforming or deforming the various pieces to determine whether those faces have become detached. So in the case of glass, we remove all the internal connected faces until the faces separate by a given distance threshold. So that's a quick setup of how to get it going. So here we're fracturing a cube. Then we're adding a connected face SOP to get those attributes. And then we'll just move a piece. And we use the disconnected faces SOP, and it automatically clears all the inside faces in this particular example until they separate. That can be stored as an attribute as well, so you can push that through a SOP solver to find out. So, for example, to determine how long the faces have been separated for. So that's also useful for emitting secondaries of a more localized part of the geometry where fracturing or separation has occurred. So instead of simply looking at velocity, acceleration, or distance from rest, or any combination thereof, and using the entire piece as a source, it allows for determining a much more localized and precise emission location from prims on that piece. So when doing erosion type effects, you may want to emit fine particulate or debris as a previously connected piece becomes detached, exposing its internal faces even though that piece itself hasn't moved. So if you imagine a cliff face after a landslide and you want, after a chunk has come off, and you simply want some runoff to keep running off those exposed faces. So a lot of this work was inspired by the game dev team. So they'd already kind of set up some of these prep nodes. So we kind of just ran wild with some of them. So the RBD configure SOP packs the geometry and proxy if needed, and sets bullet-specific attributes to drive the simulation. So it exposes some of the more esoteric attributes that come in handy for complex simulations. So you can set up geometry representation per piece, speed limits, collision groups, set the initial sleeping state to avoid having to amp up constraint strengths to stop structures from collapsing under their own weight, etc. And because we like materials, there's also a number of material-based density presets that can be overridden for manual input. So we've got 4 categories: concrete for stone, concrete, plaster, etc. There's glass for glass, porcelain, Pyrex, etc. Wood with different varieties of wood, chipboard, oak, pine, etc. And metal. So the material-based density presets have been sourced from engineeringtoolbox.com. It's a really cool website for material nerds. They have stacks of materials there for better physical representation of your various materials in Sim. So if you need more, definitely worth taking a look. The RBD.io SOP, it's the RBD counterpart to the Vellum.io SOP. So it conveniently packs the triple inputs into a single RBD packed object, saves it to disk and unpacks it on output. There's also an option for more efficient storage of RBD simulations, so it can take a 4th input, the simulation points. It stores a single frame of the geometry and a sequence of lightweight simulation points will be stored to disk. So this makes playback of the transformed RBD pieces noticeably faster with large simulations with significant disk space savings. So in 18, we've doubled down on DOPs and SOPs. So we've introduced both a Pyro solver in SOPs and RBD bullet solver in SOPs. So following in the Vellum solver SOP footsteps, we wanted to have a simple bullet solver in SOPs. That was one of the goals when we started with the RBD workflow tools. So the game dev team had previously done some groundwork in that regard, so we built upon that one. The aim with this last one is to get you up and running with RBD sims as fast as possible without having to build the dot networks every time. While trying to give you as much control as possible as simply as possible. So most of the basic features are there: collisions, ground planes, height fields, constraints. That's all set up and ready with a constraint breaking interface to make handling the constraints as easy as possible. Collisions are handled via a single input. This is where the RBD configure SOP comes in handy. When you need to mix and match static colliders with animated or deforming colliders, various geometry representations, etc. There's an editable forces subnet that's plugged into the rigid body solver's pre-solve, which allows you to add custom forces. You can access impact points as well. There's a name null, out impacts, which can be object merged if you need. And a lot of visualizers are available to help tune the sim and get feedback quickly without having to jump through too many hoops. So this is just an example of using some of the visualizers to tune the constraint breaks. So here we're looking at the name, angle, that's a distance on the constraints. So a lot of time can be spent fiddling with constraints to get the results you're after. So exposing as much info as possible was quite important. So while you can quickly visualize active and static pieces, sleeping pieces, etc., here we're just looking at the constraints really. So you can look at all the feedback attributes, or look at some of the attributes on the constraints themselves. And we've also introduced for more granular information. So when the node is active, if you right-click in the viewport, you can activate a viewport inspector. So just hover the mouse over the pieces, transfer the attributes, and you get all the information about that particular piece. To visualize information about the constraints, just set the output flag to the second output, or the constraints, and you get the constraint information. You can limit the information you want as well to avoid polluting it with too much info. So emission is literally just a click of a checkbox. So take a bunch of pre-fractured assets, each with their own render geometry, constraints, and proxy geo, or not. Scatter them around, and they'll be emitted into the sim at the current frame. The names are updated to avoid any overlaps and clashes. So that's a quick setup of how to emit RBDs. So fracture a cube. We RBD configure it so that assembles the proxy and the render geo. And then we push that into a pack, RBD pack. So that creates a self-contained asset. We do the same for a sphere. Then we merge the two. Then we assign an integer variant attribute. So we divide the PT num by 3 as these come in threes, a packed object for the geometry, one for the constraints, and one for the proxy. So that's going to be used for the new copy to point SOP attribute, the new piece attribute feature in 18. So here we're just scattering some points through a volume. Add a random orient attribute. Add the variant integer attribute, so that's going to drive the copy to point SOP. And then we unpack the instances using an RBD unpack SOP with a new ensure unique name attributes option. And push that into the RBD bullet solver, and off we go. So tweaking for good measure. And then all the constraint management is all done and all handled as well, with all the visualizer options. Yeah, so tweaking all your constraints, that's all supported. So for setting up addressing your sets, that comes in quite handy. So with the improvements and instancing from 17.5, that really pays off big time if you do all your packing upstream before any of the transforms or deformations of your instances. Obviously, you're not going to set your dress with a set of broken cube spheres and flippies, but if you had, say, a set of destruction-ready assets, say concrete blocks with rebar, metal frames, and other architectural elements, you could scatter these on top of damaged buildings and add a ton of complexity to the set really quickly and have them pile up in a realistic way. Quick shout out to Artem Smirnov, who helped on the next feature. So if you run into him and you like the next feature, yeah, give him a thanks or a drink. Keep his mind lubricated. So by far the most fun feature about the RBD bullet solver is the guiding. So it allows for much better artistic control of your sims. And for very large shots, it allows you to break down the complexity by guiding various elements separately from a single comprehensive low-res sim. So for example, if you run a low-res destruction sim of multiple buildings collapsing onto one another, and you use it as guides to sim the high-res versions of the buildings individually, it allows you to get your sims out heaps faster across multiple machines, or simply get it to fit in memory and still retain some of the character of the original simulation, of the combined simulation, sorry. So you can use animated meshes to guide the simulation, animated either manually or driven by another sim. Just bear in mind that you'll need enough individual pieces to extract meaningful transform matrices to achieve the motion that you're after. So for example, a simple twisting cube, it's not going to give you anything really meaningful. You'd have to break that up into different pieces first. So guiding is a two-step process. Well, first you need, obviously, your guide. But then the guide capture stage. So the pieces will be matched up to a guide piece. So the sim pieces will be matched up to a guide piece. Multiple pieces attached to a single guide, creating a guide cluster. So if you think of a large guide piece, and you should have a few of them, all simulated pieces being driven by that guide defines a cluster. Here the visualizer did show the guide clusters as colors with the intensity showing guide strength. The show guide capture option allows you to visualize the intended guided result at a given frame. So we set guide strength and other attributes to drive the guiding. And at that point, you can tune the strength through expressions if need be. Animation will be carried through the sim. So here you can see, as I'm diminishing or setting the strength down to 0 through expression, across the frames, those pieces would get released as they turn black. Then for the second stage, so here we're just using a simple FEM simulation to drive the guiding. So the second stage is comprised of a guiding process which happens in the pre-solve, which tries to line up the pieces to their guide piece as much as possible. So we have a blend parameter that allows you to lerp the computed guided velocity and angular velocity with the sim's natural velocities. This results in a soft spring-like constraint behavior that can help eliminate some jittering that can occur when collisions get in the way. Another method to eliminate jittering can be to increase collision padding on the problematic pieces, or increase the solver tolerance. Finally, guiding thresholds are evaluated against a piece's guide strength post-solve to determine if a piece should remain guided or break free, allowing for natural-looking behavior. So there are a number of heuristics available to determine when a piece should break free. Linear threshold is a max distance multiplied by guide strength between the computed guided position and the piece's position post-solve. So this means if a piece ends up further than the given threshold after the solve, with the collisions and the constraints being evaluated, from where it should be through sheer guiding alone, then it will break free. Angular threshold is the max angle in degrees multiplied by strength between the computed guided orientation and the piece's orientation post-solve. Distance threshold is simply the distance from the guide piece post-solve compared to the initial distance at rest. And we've also got the same but accumulated over time. So a piece has a habit of deviating away from its guided transform matrix. It'll eventually break off. So as a piece's strength decreased, as if the piece's strength decreased with every guiding violation. And finally, we have the minimum neighbors threshold. More on that in a sec. So we've got a few visualizers to help tune or debug the guiding. And here we're looking at the guided neighbor count. That's to say the number of neighbors for pieces within a guide cluster. So remember, all the pieces guided by the same guide piece define a cluster. So knowing about a piece's neighbors within a cluster can be quite useful. If a piece has no direct neighbors within that cluster during the sim, it means that all of its direct neighbors have become unguided, broken free. So it's the last one to still be driven by that guide piece. So that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it could mean that you end up with a small floating piece all alone that shouldn't be, as it's no longer supported by other pieces that might normally fit underneath. So in this case, with this visualizer, white indicates that those pieces have that feature turned off. Blue indicates 4 or more neighbor pieces going down to red with only a single neighbor. And black means that that piece is now alone. So the minimum neighbors threshold determines whether a piece should break away from its guide when its neighbor count drops below the given threshold. So while constraints are not necessary with guiding, if you think of guiding as a type of virtual constraint system, they can come in handy to keep some structural integrity in the pieces breaking off, or constraining non-guided pieces to guided pieces. So in the previous example, I had antennas and railings at the top of the building, and they weren't guided. They were just simply constrained to the concrete chunks on top of the building. Unfortunately, you can't really see it in this particular example due to the camera angle. So constraints between pieces belonging to different clusters will tend to impede on the guiding motion and result in pieces breaking away sooner as they restrict the guided movement, and therefore force pieces to go beyond their own guiding thresholds. So they'll either break off with the constraints holding them together, will unguide big chunks of solid blocks that then do whatever the sim ends up doing with them. There is an option to remove intra-cluster constraints automatically, leaving only constraints between non-guided pieces and guide pieces, and constraints between pieces within the same guide cluster. Obviously, when guiding a high-res sim from a low-res sim, having really strong glue constraints within guide clusters, it will end up giving you pretty much a one-to-one match with a low-res sim, so you may want to tweak those constraints. And finally, I'll quickly talk about customization. So while the RBD bullet solver hopefully covers most of the basics for RBD sims, you'll invariably want to be able to customize it or extend it in various ways. So the RBD bullet solver can be extended by diving into the editable forces subnet, which feeds into the solver's pre-solve input. So that allows you to add custom forces, wrangles, as well as SOP solvers with which you can pretty much do anything, other than coupling other solvers. So for example, in this setup, inspired by the Katamari Damacy game, custom force drives the large sphere, and when objects are within reach, they generate constraints on the fly which shrink over a few frames. And then we add the large sphere and the ground to the object's collision ignore attribute, so they won't stop the sphere from rolling. And with an FX license, you can just dive in and customize it however you see fit. So we're hoping to do more with it in the future. We didn't really have enough time to put everything that we wanted in there. Yeah, that's what we have for 18. So with that, I hope to have given you a bit of an insight into the new RBD tools. Yeah, thank you. Any questions?
Any questions?
So when you were seeing the guided simulations there, how many of those scenarios actually had no constraints and were just being driven by pure guides?
So the only one that had constraints was that last one when I was talking about constraints, just to show the difference in how how the pieces that become unguided can maintain a bit more of that structure. If not everything else, yeah, it was completely unguided.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry, unconstrained.
Constraint, okay.
Yeah, so it's actually quite handy. Sometimes you do have those when you're constraining to static pieces, and those constraints can be problematic. You could just guide those pieces instead and do away with the constraints.
Okay, cool.
You'll get some really nice braking behavior from it.
Any other questions? Going once, going twice. Okay. Thanks, Nick.
Cheers. Thank you.